Hi there, and welcome to this three-part tutorial series about integers in Godot. You may be thinking, why does it take a three-part series to cover something as basic as integers? Well, integers are much more interesting beasts than you might think. In this first part, we will look at what integers are and why they are used in computing in general, and also specifically what type of integer we use in Godot. So without further ado, what is an integer? So I'm sure that the vast majority of you already know that an integer is a whole number. Way back when I was in school, we learned about whole numbers first. One of the other things we learned at some point is that whole numbers go from minus infinity to positive infinity. Well, in general purpose computing, we have to place limits on the size of numbers because there is a finite amount of storage, and to do anything else would be impractical. I'm sure you know that all information in computing is stored and moved around as bits. So in any computing system, from the smallest to the biggest, there is a finite limit on how many bits are available. The modern era of computing really took off in practical terms in the 1980s when 8-bit systems became affordable. This was also the era of 8-bit gaming on home computers and consoles. An 8-bit CPU has registers that are 8 bits wide. The registers are the part of a CPU that handle instructions and perform calculations, so an 8-bit register can natively handle 8-bit values and instructions. In the 8-bit era, integers were stored as 8 bits, but with a bit of CPU magic we could also use 16-bit integers, as this gave a much more useful range of whole numbers. Over the years, the CPU register width increased to 16 bits, then 32 bits, and nowadays the norm for general purpose systems is 64-bit computing. Similarly, we have gone from 8 and 16-bit integers to 32-bit and 64-bit integers and beyond. Some CPU designs can handle 128-bit or larger integers, even though they are natively 64-bit or in rare cases 32-bit CPUs. In GDScript for Godot, integers are stored as a 64-bit number. This applies to both literal values and variables storing integer values. So why do we use integers in programming if they have limits? Well, for starters, although they are usually entered and shown as base 10 numbers in GDScript and other languages, we have already talked about how they are stored as a certain amount of bits in memory or some other storage medium. This storage as bits corresponds to how processors work with data in bits. A consequence of this relationship is that processors work very efficiently with integers, so it makes sense to make integers available to programming languages as a data type. Another reason for using integers is that they have exact and unambiguous values, so they are good for anything that can be counted with whole numbers. For example, the number of hit points a character or an enemy has, or how many times to go around a loop. The other basic numeric type we have in Godot is the float, which is short for floating point. The magnitude range of a float is extremely large compared to an integer, but beyond a certain point the precision of a float becomes, for want of a better word, fuzzy. Floats have their own advantages, which I'll cover in a separate tutorial, but their fuzziness can cause problems if what you really want is exact whole numbers. Getting back to our 64-bit integer that we can use in Godot, technically this is a signed integer, as it can be both positive and negative. It has a range of minus 2 to the power of 63 to plus 2 to the power of 63 minus 1. Notice that it is 2 to the power of 63 in each direction. This is because the 64th bit is used to indicate a positive or negative value. The 64th bit is nominally the highest value bit, and so it is called the most significant bit. Conversely, the first bit contains the lowest value part of an integer, and hence is called the least significant bit. These are often abbreviated as MSB and LSB respectively, but I won't be using such acronyms in this tutorial series. At the moment, you're probably looking at this graphic and wondering what is going on with the negative numbers. I will explain how this works in the third part of this tutorial. For the time being, please just accept that this is how the integers are stored at the binary level. Our 64-bit integer gives us a range of approximately plus or minus 9.2 quintillion in decimal, which can also be written as 9.2 thousand quadrillion, or 9.2 billion billion, or 9.2 times 10 to the power of 18. While this is a pretty big number, there is still the possibility that you'll hit this limit. For example, 9.2 quintillion meters equates to approximately 970 light years. This sounds like a lot until we look at the size of something like our Milky Way galaxy, which is about 100,000 light years across. To summarise, the two big benefits of using integers are exactness and efficiency. These are intimately related because of the way computers work with values represented as bits. Hence, if you're going to do anything that only requires whole numbers, always use integers. As we have seen, the range covered by a 64-bit integer is reasonably huge, so you're unlikely to hit the numeric limits for most things. To finish up the first part of this tutorial, let's take a quick look at some integer values in Godot. So here we are in Godot 4.1, but all of this is the same in Godot 4.0 and will be for any versions following 4.1. Integers can be literal values or can be stored in variables. A literal value is just any value typed directly into your code, which is of course GDScript 2 in our case. When the code is compiled, a literal value is stored in the most suitable storage type, so a literal integer will be stored as a 64-bit signed integer. Here are some literal values. Remember, each of these is stored as a full 64-bit signed integer when the script is compiled. You may be thinking that this seems a bit wasteful when none of these values get anywhere near using that many bits. But on modern general purpose computers, the overhead is not significant enough to worry about unless you need to work with really huge datasets. I would say though that if you're going to do the type of work that does require truly huge datasets, then using a game engine is unlikely to be the best way to do things. Also, the engine doesn't need to do anything clever to work out if it should use less bits to store smaller numbers, as it just handles every integer in exactly the same way. To further demonstrate the advantages of having a 64-bit integer, let's square the last value here and see what we get. As you can see, the result is well over 400 billion, so this is 2 orders of magnitude more than we could store in a signed 32-bit integer, which tops out at around plus or minus 2.1 billion. Even if this was a temporary intermediate value for some calculation, the headroom provided by a 64-bit integer makes life much simpler. Literal values are not much used by themselves, so let's assign them to some variables. The first variable is a variant and the rest are statically typed as ints. If you want to know more about the difference between variant and statically typed variables, please see the Godot 4 Basics tutorial about this topic, which is available on my channel. Let's see what happens when we try adding a float to our first two variables. We will print the results so you can see the difference between using a variant and a statically typed variable. As you can see, the variant has accepted the float and simply added it on. The int, on the other hand, simply adds the integer part, and we also get a message about losing precision. For the other parts of this tutorial, I will stick to using statically typed integer variables. That's it for this first part. If you enjoyed this, or at least found it informative, please like and subscribe so you don't miss the other two parts of this mini-series. Thanks for watching and see you next time.